All right. Hello. So, welcome to our live today. We are talking about A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. This is our second small book club of the year, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see what folks have to say about it. If you are watching on the replay, definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I know when I posted about this, we had some mixed opinions in the comments of those videos. So I am curious to see what folks have to say about this. I have two disclaimers as well. So first of all, these texts, all of the texts actually that I'm drawing on today, including the texts that we're talking about, are dated. They are of a certain time. And I have tried to be careful about separating sex, which is biology, from gender, which we perform as an expression of our identity. And I'm going to try and make space for the fact that there are more than two genders. But a lot of the quotations that I am pulling from are still very much stuck in the idea that but things exist in binaries. So I hope that you'll forgive me if I misspeak. That is definitely not my intention. The second disclaimer is that this time period, specifically like 20th century and earlier, is not my academic area of expertise. And I want to put that off the top because a lot of the videos that I make about more classic pieces tend to get picked up by folks writing an essay or studying for their exam. And if that is you, welcome, but don't replace this with your class notes or reading the text. We're very much here to chat about this in like a casual way. So, with that being said, I would love to know what you thought of this. What were you expecting from A Room of One's Own? I feel like it's very pervasive. I had never read it in its entirety. So many of my textbooks, actually, I went and dug out my textbooks, and we just either skipped over it because it was assumed that you would have read it already, or it was in like the back half of the textbook. So like this is my Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. We talked about all of the dead men, and then we ignored like the back 2/3 of the textbook where people who are not dead white men were thinking and theorizing about things. So like I had never read this in its entirety. I was expecting it to be a little bit dry. I don't know about you folks, but I wasn't expecting it to be like super snappy and fun. And I feel like that was true. I feel like I definitely enjoyed it more on the reread when I listened to it on audio. And maybe that has something to do with this so this was originally two speeches that were delivered at women's colleges, and then it was sort of condensed into this text. So with that in mind, right, like maybe it was never meant to be read in the same way that like reading Shakespeare is no fun. It's definitely more fun to watch it performed or to read it out loud. So yeah, what did you folks think? Did you enjoy this? And I think I'm also curious to see what you thought of the writing. So while you're sort of noodling on that, also if somebody just wants to say something in the chat to let me know that I have my settings right, that would be much appreciated. Say hi. Let me know that the chat works. Okay. So while you're noodling, hey, thank you. Thank you. So let's... Lovely. Okay. So Lydia has mentioned that they didn't mind this one, but it was just okay. I feel like I'm on the same page. And that is the experience of like 2 readings for myself. Like the first time, I'm not gonna lie, I hated it. It was like a 1 star. I finished it and I was mad. And I think it's actually the way that this is written. So if we want to talk a little bit about the writing, so throughout the piece, the narrator is being interrupted. I started going through and putting like a blue sticky note for every time the narrator was interrupted. And it was driving me crazy. Like I was getting so frustrated on this first reading. Like the number of times that she's just like in the middle of a thought and then she's like, oh, and here comes the food. Here comes the next course of my meal. Or there's a cat with no tail. And I was so annoyed. And then it wasn't until the reread that I realized how intentional that was, that she was demonstrating the experience of writing in a public space, of trying to produce art in a public space, that the impossibility of carrying through with a thought. Like you can see the narrator sort of beginning to get somewhere and then, oh, the food arrives and she picks back up with something else. So on the reread, I was like, oh, that's actually really clever. Like it's frustrating as a reader, but it's also really clever to demonstrate that. And then I feel like I was really uncharitable with the tone of the writing. So again, because she was constantly being interrupted and she was, I guess, demonstrating making fiction, right? Like there are points where she's like, oh, I already established that my character is, like your narrator, is moving through the space in the fall, but I really think this works better in the spring. And I know that that makes no narrative sense, but I'm going to do it anyway. So just roll with it, okay? And like, I was very uncharitable, I think, with that tone, that sort of like flippant tone. And it wasn't until I shared, I think on both the community tab and on Patreon, the first chapter of this being read by Natalie Dormer, and hearing another human read it, it changed how I was hearing the words, I guess. And I ended up feeling a lot more sympathetic towards the text. I still don't love it. I still feel like this is a text that has utility, but I wouldn't pick this up for the pleasure of reading it, right? Like it's very much something that I feel like you would read if you're in school, if you're studying something, or if you're a Virginia Woolf completionist, like you've already read all her fiction and you're like, oh, well, I guess this is the famous one. So I guess speaking of Woolf, we should probably talk a little bit about her. Sorry, I just noticed the chat that it felt like I was in the mind of someone that was slightly unhinged. Yes, that is a very good way to describe that sort of all over this like place feeling. It's Just Me, Carlene says that they haven't 100% finished it yet, but they're not loving it and not really hating it, but still going to finish it. That's good. I'm glad that I mean, I suppose that the folks who like really hate it probably didn't finish it and didn't show up to this. They were just like, fuck this text, fuck this person. So, which is also fair. Like, I can definitely see why people are turned off by this text. So, if we want to briefly talk about Virginia Woolf as a human, she is... she's like a late 19th, early 20th century writer. She's very important in the modernist movement, and she's considered one of the pioneering creators or users of the stream of consciousness narrative as a device, which you can see in some of her other works. And I feel like we can start to see that working here as well. I think going back to the idea that you're in the mind of someone slightly unhinged, if you're thinking about just a stream of consciousness writing, that's very much how it feels. Reading some of these like modernist, postmodernist authors that are just sort of free flowing whatever is coming out of their heads, it does read as slightly unhinged in that it doesn't fit into what we expect of a novel or of a work of fiction. It's very much unstructured, very much free flowing. So I think it's very important to note that I'm gonna borrow from Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, because I feel like they describe her quite well. So Virginia Woolf is she's part of this like early feminist criticism, how we understand it today. Like she's very much a part of that, especially with this piece actually. And so she's this daughter of well-to-do parents born into a very communicative, literate, letter-writing, visiting, articulate, late 19th century world. And she examined the cultural constraints against which even privileged women like herself had to struggle in order to forge literary careers, noting not only the inadequacy of female education, but also the negative images of women, domestic obligations, and the problematic material conditions that had historically impeded female creativity. I just love the the idea or the phrasing of well-to-do parents, because very much she was set up to succeed, right? If anyone was set up to succeed, she's born into an affluent household. Her parents didn't believe in education for women, but unfortunately, or fortunately for her, they died. And she ended up living with her brothers in a very bohemian part of the city. And she got to brush elbows with her brother's really intellectual friends. And they formed this artistic and literary community, the Bloomsbury Group. So she's positioned in this like artsy cultural hub. Perfect, right? Then in 1912, she married Leonard Woolf and they founded the Hogarth Press. So unsurprisingly, they published her work. So the fact that she has the fortune to be published, again, if your partner is the one choosing what is published, if you and your partner are choosing what is published, you've got a leg up on other not wealthy white men publishing at this time, right? Because a lot of these, I mean, it's still true even today that publishing is, we've seen the hashtag, right? Publishing so white, Oscars so white. These institutions hold up certain people. And so if you're in the fortunate place of doing it yourself, of course, you're going to do it yourself. You're going to be able to leave that mark in history. So her first novel, The Voyage Out, was published through her half-brother's publishing house. So not only did her husband have a publishing house, her brother had a publishing house. So many privileges worth noting. Also kind of cool that I didn't know about Woolf, because I generally don't look into authors. I did for this one. But Woolf was queer. Hi. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining the chat. So do let me know what you thought of this if you're just coming in. I would love to hear what you thought of this text. That's sort of our opening question, your general reactions to this piece. So things that I learned about Woolf that I think are also important to know. is that she was queer. She had a long-term relationship with a woman, and their writings, like you can see that relationship in their writings. And then also Woolf was troubled by mental illness. She was institutionalized several times, and she attempted to die by suicide at least twice before succeeding. And I guess the contemporary sort of diagnosis of her, based on like how she's been characterized, is that she maybe had bipolar disorder. So if you think about the extremes that she experienced in her career, I know there's a lot of mention, I guess, of her having these phases of just producing a text and being like elated with her production. And then once that work was done, being super, super down, super depressed. She also experienced a lot of personal trauma, sexual abuse. So a woman with a complicated life, but also a lot of privilege. And I feel like on the one hand, this text it's designed for the ears of other very privileged women. So she is speaking to women in college, so women whose parents decided that they could spend money on that. She is speaking to women who were allowed in those spaces. If you think about segregation and who is allowed in certain spaces at what time, right? So on the one hand, we're looking at very privileged women as well. But I feel like the argument itself, the thesis of this text, is still relevant, which I do want to talk about later. I'm not sure that she's thinking of like capital O other identities. So gender nonconforming people, queer people, people of color, and how many people of many different identities were not positioned historically to produce art that has a legacy that has been preserved. Because I feel like it would be ridiculous to not acknowledge that people have always been producing art. It's just not art that has been preserved or recognized as worthy of study, right? So the idea of not wealthy white men who speak English breaking into the institutions that uphold that art, I think is still relevant. And I do want to talk about that more at the end of this. So let's just pop back into the chat here. Hello, South Carolina. Lydia has mentioned that, yes, agreed, that what she is saying could apply to any individual, that opportunity equals success. And that, yes, exactly. I do think that while this is very specific, not only to her audience, but I think specific to the body of literature that she's looking at, it could also be applied more generally. So let's get into some of the quotes that I think are worth talking about, and we'll sort of go through, talk about some of the key points that I think she's making, and then I have questions sort of scattered throughout here. So page 4 of this text, we have her thesis. Quote, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction," end quote. That's where we get the title from. That's where she's starting, and that's what she's going to work towards throughout this. And she also tells us that she's going to make use of all the liberties and licenses of a novelist to tell you the story of the 2 days preceding her coming here. So she's telling listeners a story. And I love that. I love that idea that we're going to experience the tradition of oral storytelling in a way with this. So the other thing that I think is worth noting, because it's something that I'm going to be honest, I missed, that she gives us every person sort of character, and that our narrator is not one identity, right? On page 5, she tells us, here then was I, call me Mary Beaton, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, or by any name you please. And so this lack of an identity, she's very clear that it's not Virginia Woolf speaking, that she is telling us the story of this every person, of this generic woman, Jane Doe, Mary whatever you want. I think the effect of that is to make it feel more universal, that she's not writing, I am Virginia Woolf, and this is my story. And she's not writing, like, this is specifically the story of X. That it's an attempt to be more generic. Whether or not we find that successful, but that is perhaps what she is attempting to do. The other thing that I think is important is the fish metaphor. I think the fish metaphor is super important. So right at the beginning, she talks about her narrator who has this thought that has been let down into the stream. So we have this image of a woman sort of fishing, and she's just letting this thought minute after minute, hither and thither, among the reflections in the weeds, letting the water lift it and sink it until, you know, the little tug, the sudden conglomeration of an idea at the end of one's line, and then the cautious hauling of it in, the careful laying of it out. Alas, laid on the grass, how small, how insignificant this thought of mine looked, the sort of fish that a good fisherman puts back into the water so that it may grow fatter and be one day worth cooking and eating. So this metaphor, the idea that thoughts need time to sort of live in the stream, to experience life in the stream or the pond, they need the nourishment, they need time to interact with things, they need to be pulled and cooked at the right time. So the idea that great art is not just smashed out in a day. It's not like the first thing that you think of. Great art is cultivated. It's let to sort of be free range. If we want to change this from fishing to like livestock, it's like a free range chicken. And this is one of the first places where she's interrupted. So she's thinking about this idea, this thought that, you know, it's too small. She's put it back in the stream. And all of a sudden a guard shows up and they're like, hey, women aren't allowed off the grass. What are you doing? What are you doing on the grass? Women have to stay on the path. And she's interrupted in allowing this little fish of a thought to flourish. And so it comes back to the idea that women need to have, or people, artists, but specifically in her case, a woman needs to have money and a room of her own if she's to write fiction, if she's to allow these little fishies to grow into beautiful, you know, 5-star restaurant quality dishes. She has to have that time and space. And we're going to build on this idea throughout the text that those interruptions, the lack of time to sit on the grass and to cast your line into the water, the lack of just space to let your mind run free, is what has caused that lack of quality art from women. So it is not that women historically have had less intelligence, less artistic potential. It's that lack of opportunity that has prevented them from being great. And I do think we have to challenge that idea of who is defining greatness. But we're seeing how white women's personal poverty and low achievement in the arts has led to disadvantages for white women for generations if they want to succeed in those historically male spaces of great art, right? I'm putting a lot of caveats on this because Woolf is just like, women. I'm not specifying which women, but I am inserting specifically these specificity here. And I think when we're looking at this legacy of poverty, the poverty of access, I guess, right? It's not just your personal finances, it's everybody in, I'm going to use the term women, but women have historically not had access to money, right? And so we see the narrator is on this college campus and she sees the generation of men's wealth that has gone into building the space, maintaining the space, creating time and space for other men to study, creating scholarship, right? She talks about how when men who have studied at the university die, they often leave in their will a big chunk of money so that another man can study. And it's that like cycle, right? Like you have the wealth so that you can study, so that you can get a good job, so that you can leave money to lift up another man to repeat the cycle, right? And she looks at just the luxury on the men's campus. And specifically, we have this description of food and the luxuriousness of the food, the feast, and how the feast ends with really good alcohol. So the meal, you end with this opportunity to like sit around, get a little bit tipsy, talk with your fellow intellectuals, and just have this creative opportunity. And then she goes to the women's college and the meal is really poor and it's not in a beautiful space. And I think they're served like a sad tea. There's no alcohol. And like how with these inequalities are we where's the foundation, right? Like where is that foundation for women? And she talks about, in comparison, after talking about all of this wealth with the men's college, she talks about how difficult it was to raise money to build the college, the women's college. And the narrator asks, what had our mothers been doing then that they had no wealth to leave us? And then she sort of thinks about it and she says, well, I guess making a fortune and bearing 13 children, no human being could do that. Like, that's a lot to ask of somebody. And then, thinking about it even further, she looks at everything in place that prevents a foundation from being built for this women's college. So that, in the first place, to earn money was impossible for them. And then in the second, had it been possible, the law denied them the right to possess what money they earned. It's only for the last 48 years that Miss Seton has had a penny to her own name. For all the centuries before, it would have been her husband's property. Every penny I earn, they may have said, will be taken from me and disposed of according to my husband's wisdom. To earn money, even if I could earn money, is not a matter that interests me very greatly. I'd better leave that to my husband. So the idea that, again, without that foundation, how are women supposed to succeed? How are women supposed to compete in this space if historically wealth has been poured into creating spaces to allow men the intellectual and creative freedoms? How are women supposed to compete? And I think we can extrapolate, and like historically, these wealthy white male institutions have worked to preserve authority of men, right? It's not just that women aren't on, like women don't have access to the wealth to bring themselves up to that level in terms of the institutions, the academic spaces. It's arguably an active, like, pushing down, keeping down. And I think that we can apply this to many groups of people who have historically been denied access, right? If we think about how there are historically Black colleges in the United States, that Black folks were denied the right to study in white institutions, then how can you without that, like the foundations, right? The very foundations that continue to pass things forward, folks who haven't had that are automatically at a disadvantage, right? So while Woolf is specific to wealthy white women, we can see that denying people humanity, denying them voting, ownership of land, ownership of wealth, employment, it's going to result in this same poverty, like literal and intellectual poverty that we see our narrator here butting up against, right? So it's very, it's very much showing its early feminist thinking roots. I feel like it's not even remotely considering intersecting identities. Like today, we're very much in a space of intersectional feminism, which looks at how many of your identities cross over to position you socially, right? So if we think about the flower of power, so on one half of the flower, you will have the privileged position, and on the other half, you will have the sort of disadvantaged position. So if we want to think in terms of the binaries that exist, we have men and women, we have white and not white, we have straight and not straight, wealthy and poor, right? Like you can keep putting these things on like the petals of a flower around a circle. And the more of your identities that fall on the historically disadvantaged side of the flower of power, the more difficult it will be for you to succeed. That's sort of where we're at with feminism right now. And I think this all still applies. And yes, there is a note, Lydia has mentioned in the chat, that there's a note of her hope for the future based on the change that she'd already lived through. And I appreciate that. And I feel like that's maybe why this text is still worthy of reading. Like I feel like there are some if you have a degree, if you're working on a degree, they'll like start you back at the very beginning, because even as Woolf talks about in this text, not just literature is a spider web attached at all four corners. Theoretical thinking is a web attached at all four corners. It doesn't just float in space loose. And so there are pieces that I feel like if you're studying something, you will read because you have to, because the institution that is built in your education deems worthy of study. And I feel like it's that we can sort of broadly apply her ideas beyond the specificity of where she's at that makes this still interesting in and of itself, opposed to a piece that you need to read to see what everybody's built on, right? There was also the idea that she talks about that I thought was interesting. She compares how rich people are angry because they suspect that the poor want to steal their wealth. The idea that men have historically been rich, not only like in the physical, monetary owning of stuff way, but rich in the luxury of time and space, to rich in opportunities to be creative. She talks about how Tolstoy had the opportunity to just run all over and see things, live things, taste things, touch things. And of course, because he lived a rich life, a life rich in experiences, his work is rich. His work is worthy. And the idea that, like, if men are upset that other people want in on this, right? Like, if rich white men are upset that other folks want in on this, it's something that I guess challenges their, how do I want to phrase this? The sole experiencer of this thus far historically. Maybe the idea, the image of like managed forestry would be helpful here. That so like if you look at a managed forest, you'll see people go in and cut down tall trees to allow sunlight to reach through to the smaller trees, because trees have a natural lifespan. And if you let them all grow tall and you don't allow the seedlings to grow, eventually your forest will get so old that they'll die. And then there'll be a time where you don't have a forest, you have like a field, and it has to work really hard to become a forest again. You need time. So like to constantly maintain forest, you have to do some cutting to allow the saplings the nourishment, right? So the idea that if you were one of those tall trees basking in the sunlight, it would kind of suck to be cut down to allow someone else the space to grow, right? Does that make sense? That the rich are angry because they suspect the poor want to seize their wealth. But that's kind of how it has to work, right? We have to allow space for other people to have that nourishment, have that wealth, to thrive as equally, right? So then she goes on to talk about, the narrator talks about how the only reason that she has the freedom to make fiction is that she was left money by an aunt. And she says, food, house, and clothing are mine forever. Therefore, not merely do effort and labor cease, but also hatred and bitterness. I need not flatter any man. He has nothing to give me. So that if we're sort of personifying those trees again, that if you were the sapling that got none of the sunlight, wouldn't you feel a little bit bitter that you never had the opportunity to be in the sun? You never had the opportunity for those nourishments. You're buried under the canopy of the big trees. So having somebody give you that wealth, having somebody give you that nourishment, allows you the opportunity to grow. And then here's that hopeful note that Lydia mentioned. In 100 years, I thought, women will have ceased to be the protected sex. Logically, they will take part in all the activities and exertions that were once denied to them. And in doing so, in no longer being protected, in having the opportunity to experience that wealth, that richness of life, they will have the life experience to write good art, to write things worthy of study. And it's kind of fun, it's kind of hopeful in that women can now participate in all areas of life and work in Canada and the United States, in most of the world. Not in all of the world, but in most places, women do have the opportunity to participate in life and work. Almost to the point, because of capitalism, that there isn't an option to opt out. Here's the sort of like sick part, right? That money is now so important. The cost of living is so important that you have to work to make money to live. Everybody does. All genders, all races, all ethnicities. Everybody has to work under capitalism. And now we are working so hard to live that we lack, most of us lack the freedom to have the space to create, right? So, I mean, I guess we haven't achieved Woolf's utopian dream, right? That there are still folks, most of us, who don't have that freedom. It is still a very privileged position to have the richness of experience, the intellectual freedoms, to create art. Like, that is your job. Your job is to sit on the grass, throw the line in the water, and create art. That is a very privileged position still. The working part, the making money part, the fact that everybody is allowed to create art. It's allowed, but it's still privileged to do it. So looking at the chat here, yes, Lydia, you can't afford to stay home. The idea of the domestic goddess, right? The housewife, that is now a privileged position opposed to the socially scripted norm. It is interesting to see how things have shifted, and it's interesting to see feminist thinkers throughout history. Like when we move from somebody like Woolf, who a lot of her works are like, I wish I could be there. I wish I could work. I wish I could create the things, to like Shirley Jackson, who is like, again, still stuck in like the suburban madness of being a homemaker, to artists in that legacy, right? Like the legacy of these things is so interesting. And that's something that Woolf talks about as well, like this idea of legacy. And she thinks about, or the narrator at least stops to think about, well, what were the conditions of women who lived before me? Like, what were they doing? And she talks about how, this is the line that I really liked, fiction is like a spider's web attached to life at all four corners. Webs are not spun mid-air by incorporeal creatures, but are the work of suffering human beings, and are attached to grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. And then she looks up women in the library, and she learns that if women had no existence save in the fiction written by men, one would imagine her a person of utmost importance. Very various, heroic and mean, splendid and sordid, infinitely beautiful and hideous in the extreme. As great as a man, some think even greater. But this is woman in fiction. And the idea that the life of the average Elizabethan woman is sort of lost. That she's in the letters of men that have been saved. So if a sister wrote to her brother and that brother was someone famous, they've kept his work in the archives because he was worth preserving. She has been lost to history. I think, I'm going to blank on the title. The Ghost in the Throat, I think it is, by Diarny Grifa, which is looking at a poet who has been lost to history. Like, we don't even know where she's buried. We can trace her slight existence through the fact that her husband was famous and her brothers wrote letters and had a family Bible. And we know where her great-grandson is buried, but we have no idea where she's buried. Her poem is preserved because it's about her famous dead husband, right? Like the idea that the life of the average Elizabethan woman must have been scattered about somewhere. Could one collect it and make a book of it? Woolf talks about, or the narrator talks about on page 47 in this book. And that lack of roots, that lack of foundation is something that haunts sort of the literary legacy, right? So the narrator asks, maybe I'm thinking, like, right, the narrator's thinking, maybe I'm asking the wrong questions. It's not why women didn't write poetry in the Elizabethan age. It's like, how were they educated? Were they educated? Were they taught to write? Did they have a space for themselves? And how many kids did they have while they were trying to do this? We don't really know what women were doing from when they woke up to when they went to bed because they haven't been historically preserved. And how when you have this huge body of literature of white men, that there's always this rootedness. There is a person to speak back to. There is something to critique and build on, right? Like art is always speaking to those that came before it. It's connected like that spider web to what came before it. But if you don't have those four walls, if you're just the incorporeal being that doesn't have roots, that doesn't have a place to latch onto, how much harder is it to create? How much harder is it to find a literary tradition that you can build on, that you can fit in? I really appreciated the thought experiment of Shakespeare's sister, Judith. So we have this idea of Shakespeare, who is considered this great artist, great human, worthy of study. We're still reading him now. We still find something universally interesting about his works. And it's sort of chalked up to him being this genius that was allowed to flourish. And imagine if he had a sister who was trapped in the home, expected to do domestic labor, and fulfill that role of woman, get married, make babies, keep a house. So she would have no space. Even if she was educated, she wouldn't have the time or space to read, write, or think. She would always be getting interrupted. She would always have things that she was expected to do. And she imagines that a person with Shakespeare's talents who wasn't allowed to express them would be so unfulfilled as a human that they would choose to die by suicide. Shakespeare gets to be this beautiful, creative weirdo, and his sister, with the same opportunities, same level of genius, would be absolutely crushed by her life circumstances. And then she also talks about how maybe if women or people who were denied the creative space that Shakespeare had, so the traditional artistic space, maybe that's where we see witches. Maybe that's where we see a woman possessed by devils, the wise woman selling herbs, or maybe even a really remarkable man who had a mom. The narrator claims that they are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet. So the idea that this genius would just sort of leak out of people in other ways, that it would be not what we would traditionally recognize as art worthy of study, literature, poetry, but it would just have to leak out of this person in a passion for herbs, in a passion for helping people, in a passion for cooking, for quilting, for fiber arts, right? Think about all of the beautiful Scandinavian, Nordic knitting patterns, all of those intricate designs. The item itself is something that women historically would have made for a utility. Keep your hands warm so your fingers don't fall off, right? It's to keep your hands warm so that you could work outside, you could exist in unheated homes. So the object has utility. It doesn't have to be beautiful, right? All of those patterns, the textures that show up in knitting, in sweaters, in blankets, could we read that as artistic genius that was historically squashed? If you couldn't be a poet, you could make really beautiful knitwear. That extra labor doesn't have to go into an object to be useful. It's just that we would never study, historically, we would never study in a university beautiful mittens and what that says about the artist, the fiber artist that made it, right? Historically, we have valued certain art forms, painting, sculpture, literature, music. So I think it's interesting that on the one hand, Woolf envisions somebody who tries to conform to those historically male-dominated arts as somebody that would be so made to feel so small and so insignificant and so terrible that they would choose to no longer live without those arts, while then also opening up the idea of the lost novelist as a brilliant visionary woman. I suppose a visionary woman we could call witches and herbalists, and how they're making their arts there, sort of the visionary women that are not not mentally unwell, like they're finding a way to create. Lydia, yeah, you felt it was extreme as well. I wonder if that extreme with Judith is very much a self-reflective thing, that Woolf couldn't imagine not being allowed to create in those ways, and that would be her solution. Can we use that word? But yeah. So I feel like, again, I don't feel super qualified because the 17th, 18th, 19th century was not really where I spent my time. It's also not really where I choose to read. But I did enjoy her going through the special snowflakes that managed to achieve something in this space. That Afraben, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot were authors that she highlighted as succeeding. And I find it interesting that they've succeeded as art and not as popular trash art. Like, she seems to be making a distinction between women who discovered that writing could make them money and did it. So they'd be writing for pulp fiction magazines. They'd be writing trash. They'd be writing lowbrow things, memos, advertising. Do you know what I mean? It's things that we wouldn't study unless you're a print culture scholar. Things that we wouldn't read for fun. How about? And she sort of highlights that there seems to be something authentic or something valuable about these women that she highlights, despite the fact that they are not living these rich lives like Tolstoy. She sort of compares them to Tolstoy, how he was out living his best life, gathering life experiences to write the text that he does. These women are stuck in the drawing room, they're stuck in the home, but they somehow find something authentic. They find something human. And I think that's, again, why we're still studying these women, right? We find something, Jane Austen was hot. It's hard to believe it's almost been 10 years since I did my master's, but when I was doing my master's, Jane Austen was having this revival amongst my peers. Folks were taking her works and looking at them from different angles, and you would think that eventually folks would run out of things to look at, and they'd want to look at the legacy texts, right? The texts that build on Austen, but people are still finding Austen and the Brontes interesting and worthy of study. And I mean, people still read them for fun, even though the language is starting to feel a little antiquated. That You can now get annotated versions of the text to explain jokes and words and how this would have been meant in the context, right? Like, we're becoming so far removed. And do you think that these texts had something authentic that we find compelling now? Or is it that they fit in the legacy, like they fit in the men's legacy of things that we study, right? Like when we think about the canon is the canon because white men in institutions, historically, white men in institutions have deemed Dante and Milton and Keats worthy of study. And so we force people to continue to read these things, to be well read. If you want to have a conversation about literature, you have to read X, Y, and Z. So these, I don't really care about what Woolf has to say. I'm curious about what we think. Do we think that Austen and the Brontes are taking the tools that men have and starting to build that foundation for other writers, and that's why they're successful? Like that they've done something and we're still interested in them because so many people have built off of them? Or do we still study them? Do we still read them because they conform? I guess is what I'm asking. I'm going to let you noodle on that and hydrate. I'm not really sure there's a right answer. I feel like it's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. That these have been preserved because they fit within a certain legacy, but also there's something unique that makes them appealing. I think it's probably both. And then I guess the other thing that might be interesting and sort of fits with this conversation is the best way to phrase this apparently is pen is penis, ? So scholars Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar wrote a piece that I have in this massive chonker of a textbook that we never got to in school because we only care about, this is my point, right? This is the textbook that I was forced to study in school. The first third of it is what we studied. It's dead white men. The last 2/3 of it, we start getting lady thinkers. We start getting not white thinkers. And we didn't get to it in the English Foundation course because we don't really care about these people as much as we care about these people, right? In the academic space. And so these two scholars wrote a text called The Mad Woman in the Attic, The Woman Writer and the 19th Century Literary Imagination. And so they're specifically thinking about the 19th century literature. I'm not sure we could still say that pen is penis. And by pen is penis, I mean pen is the phallus, as in the symbol of male power. And so they're looking at, there was this guy who in 1886 wrote to a friend that the artist's most essential quality is masterly execution, which is a kind of male gift, and especially marks off men from women. The male quality is the creative gift. And so male sexuality is not just analogically, but actually the essence of literary power. So the poet's pen is, in some sense, a penis. And if we think about even the word author, its roots etymologically, Edward Said muses on it and breaks down how the word author has this sense of succession, of specifically paternity and hierarchy. And what does it imply? What does it mean for these 19th century women, these 19th century and earlier thinkers, lady thinkers, to have to choose the pen, to have to pick something that is in its entire construction male, masculine? What does that leave for literary women? How are, like, if the pen is a penis, what organ do women have to even use, right? And so if we think about, again, that literature is a web, that men have all of these forefathers, not only the forefathers providing them money, building the foundation of that college, providing the fellowships to study, to do creative writing masters, whatever. I just lost my train of thought. The idea of forefather, right? That's where I was going. That forefathers exist within the body of literature. It's built into the whole thing as it's constructed. What is it like to be a lady writer in the 19th century, having very few foremothers, right? To try and take this thing, this tradition, this institution that not only have you not been allowed to be a part of, it is by design not for you. It is from like the roots of the words that make up the thing. Male. It's it excludes you at every turn. And if we maybe see, like, if we think about, again, I think really with the Brontes, that there's like an anxiety. There is a lot of madness in 19th century and earlier women's writing. That the word author doesn't even correctly describe you, because author at its roots, at the roots of the word, is male, and you are a woman trying to take on this title. Does that make sense? That the more women in this time would have been educated and looking at like the Greek and Latin roots of things, that as you try and occupy this space and keep coming up against walls, right? It's an interesting, I guess, legacy that we're now seeing women building off of, right? That the legacy of white women writing now, of women writing now, of people writing now, is this very narrow box of wealthy white men who speak English. And do we still think that publishing and academic study are going to work. Do we, like, how do I want to phrase this? I mean this in like the gentlest possible way, and like with the utmost critique of the larger institutions. Because of how they've been built, because of that foundation, are they ever going to be spaces that feel comfortable to people who are not wealthy white English speaking men? Is there a value in rejecting those historically exclusive spaces? And I say this as somebody who has a background in academia, as somebody who enjoys the experience. It comes back to, again, that time and space to think. Because when you're in a master's or a PhD, you are being given the time and the space and the money to think, to write, to research. The body, the institution itself, is kind of corrupt and a problem. There's no denying that. But I sort of long to go back because it provides that space for the rich thinking, the rich experiences of going down that rabbit hole, right? But then at the same time, is there value in working outside of that space, right? Like if we think about how we're working in 2022, we have the internet, we have so many ways to make art, to make criticism online, to take it away from the institutions of, like the historical institutions of the academy and of publishing. And do we want to save those institutions? Or is it worth it to perhaps lift up historically undervalued arts? Like the fiber arts of oral storytelling, like with the internet now, podcasting, we could shift that medium, right? Like we can publish, we can self-publish. We can do what we're doing right now. We are taking a text, and as peers, we've read that text, we're talking about that text, and we're looking at how this feels to us now, right? Like we don't we don't need that academic backing. We don't need that publishing backing to say that this is good. We can put it out there and our peers can look at it. They can like it. The views on it can show like the engagement with that art, that it has touched people. It has functioned as art, right? And so I guess I'm curious, the thesis of this text, do you still find it useful that a creative person needs a room of their own and money to make art? I think yes. I think that foundation is still something that we need. And especially now, there's a line in here that money dignifies what is frivolous if unpaid for. I think especially now, we have to justify what we're doing, right? I feel this pressure personally, right? That the videos that I make are monetized to justify the time that I have spent on them. I'm not creating for creation's sake. I'm creating because I want to be creative. Like, I truly enjoy this, but I need the finances to justify it to everybody else. I need to carve out this much time on my weekend to be creative, right? Does that make sense? Sorry, there's a lot of thoughts happening here with the last of this book. Like, I still see value in her thesis. I am questioning whether or not we should even, I mean, she couldn't conceive of the internet. That is so far outside of her realm of thinking, right? Like, she's thinking like, oh, how do I get people into this space? How do we get access to this space? Like, first of all, we just need to be on an equal playing field. Money and space. But like, do we even want to be in that space is the question that I'm left with at the end of this. If we think about, I'm sure folks have seen Jess Owen's book Community, how many times the nonsense of publishing comes up, that publishing values certain people over others. Publishing values certain narratives. If they're going to publish a narrative by a person of color, they want to see trauma porn. Trauma porn sells. We don't want to see happy queer people. We want to see sad queer people. Right? Like, there are narratives that sell. Do we want to participate in that institution? If the foundation is shitty and shaky at best, do we want to continue to build on that house, right? Make it biblical. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the foolish man built his house upon the sand. If we're building on that house of sand, right? If the legacy is on sand, do we want to keep building on it? Or, especially when we have things like the internet, we have different forums, the freedom of podcasting, of self-recording. I don't know. Those are sort of where I'm left with this book. So a major deviation, but something that I'm quite pleased I'm now thinking about. Like, it's nice to see the roots of this thinking. And it's nice to think about the possibility to do otherwise, to create in different ways, in different spaces. So, do folks have any final thoughts about A Room of One's Own? Did thinking about it in this way make you feel differently towards the text at all? I still don't enjoy it, like, as a piece. This is not something that I'm going to pick up for fun as like a comfort read. But I think on the reread, on sort of pulling together notes for this, I have appreciation for where this is at in its time and place, in its context. So yeah, I'll give you folks a moment to add any final thoughts on that. And I'm going to talk about the next two book club reads. So The next book club in May is patron exclusive, and we are reading Firestarter by Stephen King. So this is part of the Red Rum Book Club we're reading through in publication order. This is available to patrons at all tiers, so if this interests you at all, we're meeting at the end of May to talk about this. The next free to everyone on YouTube book club, patrons voted, and I'm excited for this because this sounds like it's going to be a fun time, and maybe building a little bit on some of the loose threads that we have here today. So the book that was chosen is Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsforth. Rainsford, yes, with a D. And this is a haunted, surreal debut novel about an otherworldly woman, her father, and her lover. And the thing that I am most excited about this is the Goodreads synopsis that the idea of it pulling the reader into a dream between fairy tale and nightmare, desire and delusion, folktale and warning. That just sounds up my alley in many ways. It sounds like we're going to be able to think through womanhood and fairy tale, and I don't know, I'm excited. I'm excited for it. I don't really want to know too much about it. Those just keywords have piqued my interest and I'm excited. So that we will be meeting at the end of June for, so plenty of time to get both books and either pay for Firestarter or join us for free at the end of June for Follow Me to Ground. And I will be posting about Follow Me to Ground as well. So if you miss the title or whatever, it'll be there. So yeah, that is sort of where we're at. Let's check in with the chat here. Lydia, it was nice to delve in here because I definitely didn't think about it in the sense of the future and participating in that same type of cogwheel. Yeah, it is a nice... Again, this isn't a place where I read a lot, so it is nice to see how this fits into everything. Both what it's looking at before it, and I think how we think about what comes after it. So yeah, I think it might be a stretch, but it might be interesting going from Woolf thinking about writing fiction to in June then reading women's fiction that I think has a bit of a feminist preoccupation to it. So if I can, I will try and connect these. That might be a stretch because I haven't read Follow Me to Ground, but if I can, I will try and make these connect. So yeah, I am at the end of my notes. I have no more housekeeping, so I am going to head out. I want to thank you folks for being here, for watching, for listening. If you are here on the replay, definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, I hope everyone is doing well, that you're staying safe, and we'll see you soon. Bye.